What was the dating scene like before we had Tinder? To answer this question, we need to go back to the beginning of humanity. So let's get out our time machines and head back to the Stone Age to see what dating was really like. Starting off with the Neanderthals, it's safe to say that they were a lot more hairy than us modern humans. They also lived about 400,000 years ago and occupied parts of Europe and parts of Asia. And since we were still living in the Stone Age, there was no such thing as deodorant. So if you wanted to attract a partner, you needed to smell good. It's believed that Neanderthals would cover themselves in fragrant herbs and flowers to mask their not-so-fresh body odor. If you think about it, that's probably why we associate certain flowers like roses with love and romance today. The ancient Neanderthals were kind of like the original romantics. Along with covering themselves in floral scents, Neanderthals would also use red ochre, which is a type of clay, to paint themselves. This was probably done for two reasons. First, it helped them stand out from the rest of the herd, making them look more attractive to potential partners. Second, anthropologists believe that the red color may have symbolized courage and strength. Red has always been associated with strength, power, and courage. You only have to look at how many sports teams incorporate the color into their uniforms. Maybe your favorite football team uses it to scare their opponents, or the reason you might find black and dark blue cars more appealing than others. Even though we know that Neanderthals had a strong preference for the color red, new research suggests that they actually couldn't see it. A recent study found that the Neanderthal genome had a genetic mutation that rendered them unable to see the color red. As you can imagine, this discovery shocked the scientific community. After all, we've always assumed that if Neanderthals couldn't see the color red, then they wouldn't have painted themselves in it. Well, it seems that while they couldn't see red, they could see its absence. Basically, they could see the complementary colors of red, which are green and purple. So when they mixed red pigments with other materials, it would give them an orangey-brown color. Since it was distinct from all the other colors, they would use it to decorate themselves and their tools. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't exactly the same as our modern-day red, but it was close enough to convey the same message of courage and power. Now that we've covered the way Neanderthals would spruce themselves up to attract a mate, let's talk about how they'd actually meet these potential partners. Back in the Stone Age, life was tough. There were dangerous animals everywhere, not to mention other tribes looking to steal your food or kill you for fun. That's why it was important for prehistoric people to live in groups. For Neanderthals, living in a group meant safety in numbers. It also made hunting and gathering food much easier. On top of that, it gave them more opportunities to socialize and find a partner. Imagine you're a Neanderthal man who spends his days hunting wild game. Living in a small group means you're bound to run into the same people every day. You might start chatting with them around the campfire at night. Before long, you've made some friends. Eventually, one of those people becomes more than a friend. That's the benefit of living in a tight-knit community. Everyone knows everyone else, so there's no need to waste time getting to know someone new. In fact, it was probably frowned upon if you didn't stay in your community. Back then, it was common for arranged marriages to take place. This just means that the families of two people would arrange for them to get married. Most of the time, these unions were between people within the same community. So if you left your group, you wouldn't be able to find a partner unless you came back. The only problem was that sometimes these groups would fight each other over resources. Sometimes these fights would end in a member of one group being banished. If this happened, they would either have to join another group or die trying to make a new one. So even though staying in your community was the safest option, it wasn't always an option. And when you really want something, you'll do anything to get it, including running away to be with your true love. Back in the Stone Age, it was common for prehistoric people to travel between groups. Typically, this would be to trade goods, but it could also be to find a new partner. When a lone traveler would arrive at a settlement, he would likely be greeted by wary eyes. After all, he doesn't know anyone here and he might be carrying a weapon. That's why it's believed that prehistoric people would give gifts to show that they had peaceful intentions. These gifts could be anything from extra food to handcrafted tools. It was a way for outsiders to show that they weren't a threat and to make friends. Hopefully, after getting to know the people of the settlement, they would accept him and maybe even allow him to stay for a while. If the visitor was lucky, he would eventually become part of the group and gain access to their single women. Back then, finding a partner wasn't about swiping right on an app. It was about showing that you were trustworthy. Once you established that you were a trustworthy person, you had a pretty good chance of finding a wife. It was very rare for prehistoric people to have multiple partners. This is mainly because there was no birth control. If a woman got pregnant, she would have to leave the group for a few months to give birth and recover. Men didn't want babies popping out all the time, so they usually stuck with just one woman. This is also the reason why it was common for couples to wait until they were older to have children. After all, giving birth was extremely dangerous, and men wanted to make sure that their partner would be okay. And of course, they wanted to make sure that the child was really theirs before settling down. Today, people can go through dozens of profiles in just an hour, but back in the Stone Age, it took a lot longer to find a match. Instead of swiping right on a dating app, prehistoric men had to prove themselves worthy by bringing back food and protecting the group. Women had it a little easier in that regard. All they had to do was cook and clean. Okay, it might not have seemed that easy, but cooking was probably a lot simpler back then. They didn't have fancy ovens and kitchen gadgets. As long as they had a fire, they could feed their family and maybe even some guests. Women also spent a lot of time collecting fruit and vegetables. She would typically do this with other women in the group. It was a great time for them to catch up and gossip about the latest news. After all, they didn't have social media to stay updated, so word of mouth was the best way to learn what was going on. If you're watching this video, chances are you're not yet married. Don't worry though, because you still have plenty of time. In prehistoric times, the average age of marriage for women was 17. For men, it was 21. Of course, these ages varied depending on where you lived and how developed your society was. But overall, that's how old people were when they settled down. Today, the average age of marriage for women in the US is 28. For men, it's 30. So even though it's trendy to marry later in life these days, back in the Stone Age, you were expected to find a partner as soon as you reached adulthood. When we think about our distant ancestors, it's natural to wonder how they lived. Were cavemen monogamous or polyamorous? What did their family structure look like? And what kind of relationships did they have? We know that the concept of monogamy is relatively recent in human history. But what about before then? Were cavemen truly as wild as some people suggest? Did they have harems of women who bore their children? Did men live with multiple wives? How common was polygamy back then? There are many theories and ideas about the nature of romantic relationships between cavemen and prehistoric humans. In this video, we will take a look at the evidence and try to answer the question, were cavemen monogamous or polyamorous? Let's start. The idea that cavemen lived in a state of constant promiscuity is appealing to some extent. It suggests a world where there were no restrictions on sexual behavior and everyone did whatever they wanted. However, this view is not supported by the evidence. In fact, anthropological studies show that even in societies that are considered to be more promiscuous, there are still limits and taboos that are observed. It's important to note that the term promiscuity can be interpreted in different ways. For some, it refers to having multiple sexual partners within a short period of time. For others, it means engaging in sexual activity outside of marriage. There is also the extreme version of promiscuity, which is having sex with anyone regardless of gender or age. Whatever the definition, there is no evidence that cavemen engaged in these behaviors. In fact, the opposite seems to be true. Most anthropologists agree that the majority of prehistoric humans lived in monogamous relationships, just like many people today. This is based on the study of human evolution and the analysis of our genetic makeup. The idea that cavemen were polygamous goes against the very essence of monogamy. If men had harems of women, why would there be a need for monogamy in the first place? The theory that cavemen were polygamous is more likely a reflection of our own modern values and beliefs. Some people may want to believe that cavemen were promiscuous because they envy the freedom that it represents. Others may be curious about the possibility of having multiple partners themselves. Whatever the reason, it's important to separate our own desires from the truth about the past. Evidence from the fossil record shows that humans have been living in monogamous pairs for at least 300,000 years. During this time, we have found numerous examples of male and female skeletons that show signs of having lived together and cared for each other, such as injuries that were treated or illnesses that were endured. These findings suggest that pair bonding has been an important part of human relationships since the beginning. While there may have been rare cases of polygamy in prehistoric times, it was by no means the norm. Most likely it occurred when one man had access to many women, such as a chief or a leader. Even then, it was probably not as common as we might imagine. One way that scientists have studied the mating habits of cavemen is through the analysis of DNA. By studying the genes that are responsible for reproduction, researchers can gain insights into the sexual behavior of our ancestors. One particular gene, called the cytotoxic T-cell-associated protein 4, or CTLA4, has been linked to male-male competition for access to females. Studies have shown that the strength of this gene is related to the degree of sexual conflict between males and females. That is, the greater the competition for mates, the stronger the gene tends to be. When researchers analyzed the CTLA4 gene in humans, they found that it was not as strong as in other species that exhibit more promiscuity. This suggests that sexual conflict, and therefore competition for mates, was not as intense among our ancestors as it is in other animals. Instead, our findings suggest that humans have evolved to live in monogamous relationships. Another way to understand the mating habits of cavemen is to examine the archaeological record. By studying ancient tools, weapons, and other artifacts, researchers can learn about the social structure and behavior of prehistoric humans. For example, the discovery of jewelry and ornaments that were made during the Stone Age can provide clues about the importance of mate choice and pair bonding. Caveman jewelry and ornaments are thought to have been used as a way to attract potential partners and to signal availability. This suggests that our ancestors did not live in a state of constant promiscuity, but rather engaged in courtship rituals and made efforts to secure a mate. One of the most famous pieces of caveman jewelry is the Ishango bone. This is a fragment of a baboon femur that was discovered in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and is thought to have been used as a pendant or amulet. The bone dates back to the Middle Stone Age and has a series of markings on it that have been interpreted as a calendar or a tally system. Some have even suggested that the markings represent a form of early writing. The Ishango bone and other similar artifacts suggest that cavemen were capable of abstract thought and that they had the ability to plan ahead and engage in symbolic behavior. This is evidence against the idea that they were uncivilized or that they lived in a state of constant promiscuity. To further investigate this topic, archaeologists have conducted experiments to determine how cavemen may have made ornaments and jewelry. One study published in the Journal of Archaeological Science found that the majority of ornaments made by modern humans using Stone Age technology were small and lightweight. This is consistent with the types of ornaments that have been found in the archaeological record. The study also found that the process of making ornaments was time-consuming and required specialized tools. This suggests that ornament production was not a casual or promiscuous activity, but rather a deliberate and meaningful one. In addition to jewelry, cavemen also created works of art that may have had a connection to mate choice and pair bonding. Cave paintings and petroglyphs have been found all over the world and depict a variety of subjects, including animals, plants, and human figures. Some of these paintings have been interpreted as representations of sexual activity. For example, the Bhimbetka rock shelters in India contain some of the earliest examples of human art. The paintings date back to the Paleolithic period and include images of animals, geometric patterns, and human figures. Some of the human figures appear to be engaged in sexual activity, suggesting that this was a subject that was important to prehistoric humans. The Chauvet Cave in France is another site with some of the oldest and most impressive cave paintings in the world. The paintings date back to around 30,000 years ago and include a variety of animals, as well as some human figures. While there are no explicit images of sexual activity, some scholars have argued that certain paintings may represent rituals or ceremonies related to fertility and reproduction. Overall, the evidence from cave paintings and petroglyphs is limited and open to interpretation. However, it does suggest that mate choice and pair bonding may have been important aspects of prehistoric human culture. What did prehistoric men do all day? For most of human history, we're told that men were the hunters, pursuing wild game across the land and providing sustenance for their families. Meanwhile, women stayed home taking care of the children and gathering food. But was it really that simple? Did men hunt and women gather? And what about those pesky cavemen who were probably more concerned with Instagram than hunting? Now, even though we usually think of prehistoric people as living in caves wearing animal skins, and generally not much more than that, the truth is they were a lot like us, complex, creative, and social beings. So it stands to reason that there would be different roles within prehistoric society, just as there are in ours. The question is, were these roles based on gender? When it comes to our distant ancestors, we don't have a whole lot of evidence to work with. We know what they wore based on a few pieces of well-preserved clothing found at archaeological sites. We can take educated guesses about what they ate by examining the bones of animals they hunted and plants they gathered. And while none of these things are definitive proof of how gender roles worked in prehistory, they can paint a pretty clear picture. For example, one common theory about prehistoric gender roles is that men were responsible for hunting animals, while women took care of gathering food. In this scenario, men would go out into the wilderness with spears and bows and arrows, bringing home meat to feed their families. Women, meanwhile, would stay back at the camp and pick berries, dig up roots and nuts, and collect other wild foods. This division of labor has been observed in many cultures throughout history and is still seen in some traditional societies today. But is there any evidence that it was also practiced by prehistoric people? Well, to answer that question, we need to look at the physical evidence left behind by ancient humans, and there are several lines of evidence that suggest that men and women had different roles in prehistoric society. First, consider the fact that humans are one of very few animals that regularly hunt other animals. It's true that some female mammals will kill other animals in order to defend themselves or their young, but only humans regularly kill other animals simply for food. This suggests that hunting was an important part of human culture long before the days of caveman. And since humans needed to eat meat to survive, it makes sense that this task would be given to the strongest members of the community, namely men. Another piece of evidence comes from the study of ancient skeletons. Archaeologists have found that the bones of prehistoric men are significantly heavier than those of contemporary women. This suggests that men were larger and stronger than women, which again makes sense if they were the ones doing the hunting. In addition, archaeologists have found that prehistoric men often had more injuries to their bones than women did. This could be evidence that men were more likely to participate in dangerous activities, such as hunting, which required strength, speed, and agility. All of these pieces of evidence together suggest that prehistoric men were more likely to hunt animals than women were. But what about the idea that women gathered food while men went out to hunt? Is there any evidence to support this theory? Well, there is some evidence that women did indeed gather food, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they did so while men were hunting. You see, gathering food was an important part of prehistoric life. After all, humans need to eat in order to survive, and gathering wild plants and fruits was a reliable way to make sure that everyone in the community had enough to eat. In addition, gathering food was a relatively safe activity, which meant that it was often done by children and the elderly as well as women. This is supported by the fact that the bones of prehistoric women show signs of osteoarthritis, which is a condition that often develops in people who do a lot of gathering. This suggests that women were more likely to gather food than men were. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that women gathered food while men hunted. Instead, it's more likely that men and women had different roles in prehistoric society when it came to food. Men may have hunted animals, while women gathered plants and fruits. This would allow each gender to take advantage of their unique strengths and skills, and it would also ensure that the community had a reliable source of both meat and plant-based foods. Another line of evidence that suggests that prehistoric people had gender roles comes from the study of ancient art. Over the years, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of pieces of prehistoric art depicting animals, humans, and geometric patterns. Some of this art is extremely realistic, while other pieces are more abstract. But one thing that all of these pieces have in common is that they seem to have been created by men. You see, most of the cave paintings found in France and Spain, which are some of the oldest pieces of prehistoric art, depict animals that were commonly hunted by prehistoric humans. This suggests that prehistoric men were more likely to be artists than women were. In fact, some researchers believe that the development of artistic skills was actually an important part of what made prehistoric men more attractive to women. That's because art is a way of expressing oneself creatively, and this is something that would have been highly valued in prehistoric society. After all, being able to create something beautiful and unique would have been a sign of intelligence, skill, and imagination. All qualities that would have been desirable in a mate. Of course, this is just speculation on my part, but it's an interesting theory that could help explain why so much prehistoric art was created by men. Unfortunately, there isn't much evidence to support or refute this theory. Most prehistoric art was found in caves, which were often used by multiple people over the course of many years. This means that it's difficult to know who created any given piece of art. Perhaps the most convincing evidence for prehistoric gender roles comes from the study of ancient burial sites. When prehistoric humans died, they were often buried with certain objects that were thought to help them in the afterlife. For example, archaeologists have found the skeletons of prehistoric men that were buried with spears and other weapons. This suggests that these men were warriors who were killed in battle. In addition, the bones of some prehistoric men have been found next to the bones of animals that they had hunted. This provides further evidence that men were responsible for hunting in prehistoric society. On the other hand, the bones of prehistoric women have often been found buried with objects such as beads and jewelry. This suggests that women were more likely to engage in activities related to fertility and reproduction. In fact, some prehistoric burial sites have been found to contain the remains of multiple women and children, which suggests that they were buried together after a mass death event such as a flood or earthquake. This could indicate that prehistoric women were responsible for caring for the sick and elderly in their communities. Ultimately, the evidence is clear. Men and women had different roles in prehistoric society. However, these roles were not always rigid. For example, there are many examples of prehistoric women who were buried with weapons, which suggests that they too participated in hunting. In addition, some prehistoric men were buried with jewelry, which suggests that they too participated in activities related to fertility and reproduction. In conclusion, it seems that prehistoric people did indeed have gender roles. However, these roles were not as rigid as those seen in modern society. Men and women were able to participate in activities traditionally associated with the opposite gender, and they were often able to pursue a variety of interests and activities. This is evident from the various examples of prehistoric women who were buried with weapons and prehistoric men who were buried with jewelry. Overall, it appears that prehistoric people were more flexible when it came to gender roles than we are today. Thank you for watching. Do you think prehistoric people had gender roles? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to stay tuned for new videos. See you next time.